I'm Brian Paddock, and I'm going to have to. I want to basically review just a little bit of the framework of Tennessee law, because we have one thing that's not typical of states who operate only under the Clean Water Act. We actually have a separate program called the Aquatic Resource Alteration Program and Permit, which deals with hydrological modifications. Unlike most states, that's authorized in our state law. And our Tennessee Water Quality Act, very interestingly, was actually passed before the Federal Clean Water Act. And then it was later amended to add the authority of the state to accept both money and delegated legal authority from the federal government on the Clean Water Act. But having been written by a Vanderbilt law professor and a bunch of students before there was a Federal Clean Water Act, it was written in a fairly comprehensive and expansive way, which, despite the best efforts of the polluters, has not been rolled back completely, although there have been a few holes bitten into it.
Well, before Brian goes on, let me just say, in the Tennessee legislature last year, it was a pretty terrible situation. I mean, you see what's happening in the federal government. So there is chop, 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 chop on all of our environmental protection laws. And the agency in charge of water protection in the state, the Department of Conservation and Environment, has lost most all of its senior staff who were mission-oriented. Like I was saying, Paul Davis, Dan Eager, the head of enforcement. These folks have been leaving the agency in droves because under this governor's administration, his deal is efficiency of permitting. That is streamlining, and it is customer service. So whereas you used to call to get information about a permit from a permit writer, now you get customer service.
PR.
Okay.
So we had our own statute, and this is the amended version after the Clean Water Act. And basically, the really interesting part is it defines pollution as any change in water. No matter what you put into it, including heat, and if you change the way it reacts with the species that are in it and near it, why you have polluted. So there's basically, there's really nothing you can do. What some people say is that the only thing that's not under the Tennessee Water Quality Act is swimming pools. Although some people think that an isolated farm pond that's not hydrologically connected to anything else and is fed totally by precipitation would be exempted. So waters of the state, it's anywhere and everywhere unless it's a swimming pool, essentially. Totally on somebody's land, unconnected to anything hydrologically. Wet weather conveyances are something that has been at issue in Tennessee in recent years, and an amendment was passed to our statute setting up a system whereby TDEC would regulate the identification of wet weather conveyances, which are very important because that's among other things, headwater streams that really start and feed all of our things that we recognize as tributaries, blue line streams, and so forth. And we now have a system where people can get certified as having the necessary knowledge and expertise to do this, and a system, and I'll tell you, when the Gang of Eight passed this statute as it was negotiated and amended,
about four or 5 years ago?
Yeah, about 4 years ago. They didn't realize, I think, what they had gotten, which is that TDEC had 2 or 3 years to write the regulations and make this as scientifically based and expert-based as possible. So if you're somebody who wants to develop a piece of land and you want something characterized as a wet weather conveyance rather than a stream, even an intermittent stream, you've got to hire somebody who actually has a certification from the state as having gone through the training and passed it, and that person is supposed to then do a report and so forth. It has all the details about why he thinks it's a wet weather, he or she thinks it's a wet weather conveyance, and then the state has 30 days to look at that report and tell you they disagree.
But this was a part of taking away some water protection. It was a way to let the polluters have input into designating streams that weren't suitable for protection.
Is the Corps still wrestling with it at the federal level in terms of delisting the significant nexus, intermittence?
Well, the issue of jurisdiction in the Corps is
the Army Corps.
Yeah, is really separate, and it's an ongoing.
It is still.
It's an ongoing struggle.
So the Tennessee Aquatic Resource Alteration Permit, which is just one of the permits that we'll talk about, and we're going to talk more about tomorrow. The law. This is more how you can get into it. The ARAP, as we call it, is the sort of equivalent. We're going to go both of those. We're
of
404.
NPDES and
the Army
ARAP,
Corps.
Yeah. By the way, this you can't read it because it's the wrong color, but it says stream. That's a stream. That's not a weather conveyance.
Is this state certification you mentioned, is that an option for people interested in citizen monitoring?
Say that again.
This certification you mentioned,
sure,
for doing this type
anybody,
of inventory?
except that you're going to have
qualified hydraulic expert.
You're going to have to really qualify yourself with a good deal of academic as well as field experience.
And that is, to have it recognized, there's a whole procedure through TDEC. So you have these.
They give the classes and you have to pass.
Yeah.
Yeah. Brian Mary, on his last question about the jurisdictional, I mean, and I'm wondering if anybody knows anything different. I mean, I know the Corps and EPA have issued their post-Rapanos guidances, and they've updated them a couple of times, but I think those are the latest, greatest things that are out there until the Supreme Court takes another case and makes it worse.
Yeah,
right.
Yeah, the real fights over that, I think you're absolutely right, the real fights over that are on the ground on a specific site. And can you do a dye trace, prove a hydrological connection, somehow show that there's a groundwater passage that goes to navigable waters, so-called,
Jurisdiction becomes an issue
so
for all our
forth.
public
But,
lands.
as Mary was saying, the Tennessee ARAP program operates independently of that, and the ARAP program has jurisdiction over both wetlands and watercourses that the Corps says are non-jurisdictional.
So the Tennessee.
So you still have to get a Tennessee ARAP to do these things, even if you don't need a 404 from the Corps.
The Tennessee, is broader, could be broader. If you get a 404 jurisdiction determination, that'll pretty much settle the ARAP, but it wouldn't work the other way around. Necessary.
I'm sorry this is cutting off. I don't know what's happening here. So, and wetlands are the other thing that are covered by ARAPs, as well as watercourses. Pollution under Tennessee law is doing anything at all, and this is the kind of thing that occasionally happens. Somebody says, oh, I'm put my mobile home on a floodplain. I guess the way to keep the water out of my trailer is to deepen and widen the channel so that the flood can stay in the channel. It doesn't work hydrologically, and it is you couldn't get a permit to do this, and it would be a clear violation if you just did it. So, unfortunately, the department has very few people out in the field looking. So this is where citizens come in. You see somebody like that doing it. Why you can actually file an anonymous complaint with the TDEC office. They don't ask for your name. You can even email them a photograph, although that's harder to do anonymously.
Although there was some movement in the legislature a couple of years ago to take away the ability
to file
TDEC
anonymous
to have an
complaints,
anonymous complaint. It didn't pass, but there's a lot of that going around in the legislature.
So the ARAP permit is used to deal with these hydrologic modifications. This is a situation where TDOT was going to probably culvert this stream for a distance to put in a a water crossing, a road crossing, and under ARAP rules, if you get a permit for this, you've got to actually take the flow of the stream around your work area so that you're not, so that your water is not coming by and dragging off mud and concrete and everything else. It's kind of, if I had my way, they wouldn't be allowed to do it, but then you got to have roads, so. So we're going to try to keep this out, and of course we've had all kinds of issues with dams, and something's happening upstream here. You can see all the mud coming down from that area, and that's the kind of thing. If you're a citizen earth cop, why you watch for that.
So, Brent, are you going to get into the 118A complaints in this?
At the end. The next thing is the what we call the ag exemption. Sometimes it's ag and forestry, and basically says that normal farming and forestry activities are not controlled, and certainly anything that's done on the land by way of forestry or logging that does not result in a point source discharge. Now, when farmers try to dry out their land and actually drying out a wetland, or when a logger actually creates such a bad situation that the mud runoff from the cutting site channelizes itself into a creek by simply cutting its own path, that's actually considered a point source discharge. And in that case, we actually have a stop work provision where the department can go out and tell a logger he has to stop. Unfortunately, he's usually 2 watersheds away by the time they get there. So you got, in both ARAPs and in the next kind of permit we'll talk about, NPDES, why you have both an individual permit and a general permit. And the general permits are supposedly the low impact things that people do a lot of and that are not even cumulatively going to create much of a problem. Again,
and you wouldn't necessarily get public notice of a general permit activity.
In both, you do get notice on individual, and I'll show you how that works. On the generals, you don't. But if you see something happening, you can certainly find out from your local TDEC office if a general ARAP has been issued. And these are the kinds of ARAP general permits. And for example, I'm dealing with a kind of interesting case right now where you've got a company that wants to take a lot of water out of a creek, and they said we want a general ARAP because we're going to put in this big concrete box and some screens and suck 1 million gallons of water out of the creek per day. And we sort of wrote a letter to TDEC when that application first showed up on the water log, and basically said, excuse me, but putting the intake and outfall structure in the creek might be done under a general permit, but the water withdrawal cannot be done.
So, Brent, can you explain what the water log is?
The water log, actually what they now call it generally is the database. TDEC now has, if you just type in, they're databases, but they're called data viewers. Data viewers. So if you type in TDEC data viewers, they've now consolidated a place where you can get the whole list. And there's one for water, which now has water permits, but also is gradually being populated with the oil and gas permits.
It's so skimpy and bare bones, though.
Yeah, it's really,
it's very
primitive.
Numbers or the purpose of the well for half of it.
Well, the beginning of a filing system is to have the filing cabinet.
Sure.
And the filing folders. Then how fast you put anything in them. If you're,
well, we're going to help them as much
sure
as we can.
And when you finish with that, if you'd help me catch up on my filing, I'd really appreciate it.
There for you, buddy.
So this is the Federal Clean Water Act 404, and this says the way you're supposed to approach the question of permitting, and particularly on wetlands, but generally. Avoid it if you possibly can. minimize anything you can't avoid, and then compensate so that you get no net loss of water resource. Unfortunately, too often the permit writers really don't do a good job on avoidance and minimization, and somebody says, here's my application, here's a check for mitigation, and thank you very much for my permit. So that's one of the places where citizens can really push back to make sure that those steps are really followed and thoroughly evaluated. Because you're supposed to have the alternatives analysis to demonstrate that impacts are unavoidable. And there's actually Sixth Circuit case law, which has been completely ignored by TDEC, and as far as possible by the Corps, which basically says that you actually can be told that you can't develop a site, that you've got to go out and find other things, unless there's some magic about that. The fact that you own the site is not controlling of whether you've whether you've looked for alternatives. If you can build your shopping center a little further down the road where it's high and dry, then you're not supposed to fill a wetland. I've never been able to force TDEC into looking at that. They always take the position that the applicant is entitled to just deal with the land he has and try to do the avoidance and minimization within the context of that land. There's a lot of controversy about mitigation, particularly since the Corps went to favoring mitigation banks for wetlands.
So instead of doing the mitigation in the watershed of the impacted water, which is what we would prefer, they do this out-of-county banking, spring bank.
Yeah.
That was our one success in the legislature where we were tied in. We and the Tea Party, the Sierra Club and the Tea Party, defeated a Haslam administration bill that would streamline permits, and we didn't want this going to the out-of-county stream bank. The Tea Party just didn't believe in mitigation at all, and the Republican members of the committee, together with our allies, the 3 or 4 Democrats, on an 11-person committee, defeated the Haslam administration, which would have streamlined the permit.
It would have been actually the first recognition of mitigation in the Water Quality Act. And quite frankly, the bill started out pretty good the way the TDEC lawyers drafted it. And what they did was they immediately took an amendment from the road builders that screwed it up. And by the time we'd even had the first conversation, they said, well, it's not that, it's this now. And we said, if you've climbed in bed with the road builders before you've even talked to us, why, we're obviously not going to get anywhere. Yeah, the Tea Party guys up there were saying things like, mitigation, making people pay if they change something, that's extortion. It's their land, it's their water, it's their water course, it's their wetlands, and so forth. And extortion was actually the word that's used. So there's been also a lot of debate on replacement ratios and the dollar value per foot of what it costs to really deal with a stream. Because what it takes to restore a stream as a replacement for a stream that's been damaged or culverted elsewhere really varies a lot with the condition of the place you want to expend the mitigation money. So this is Paul Davis's slide, and he says, this is pretty much the most powerful piece of the Federal Clean Water Act, and of course it has all the cross references back to the water quality standards and so forth, and toxics and that kind of thing. It says see next slide, but I don't think I put it in the next slide. Yes, I did. The permits are, and this is a situation that allows essentially the state by delegation to go ahead and issue permits with conditions to allow discharges, including discharges that contain pollutants into waters of the United States and waters of the state.
So the Oh, you got it
Oh
there.
boy, it's all cut off at the top.
So
I don't
the
know what's going on.
NPDES permit for NIPD's National Pollutant Discharge Elimination System, that's what you'll deal with a lot. The states you've got ARAP permits and you've got NPDES permits.
Right. Paul put in there that he says authorized rather than delegated because EPA has its enforcement authority to see that this stays straight, although getting them to pay attention again is a separate push that citizen enforcers have to do. And all Region 4 states, which we're in, are authorized.
EPA Region 4.
So how do you find out about this stuff? Well, you find out about it by looking at your windshield mostly, or somebody that's affected. But you can get on the list for the TDEC notices. And once and sometimes twice a month, this electronic notice will come out. And I'm sorry this is so fuzzy, I couldn't get it to. But for example, it says, okay, here's individual NPDES construction stormwater permits. So that's construction that's going to have a sufficient potential impact that it couldn't get a general permit, which is what they give for the smaller sites. And it tells you what it is. It's Heritage Point, which is a big development up in Sullivan County. It's near Kingsport and so forth. And it tells you the lat long. And one of the first things we do in analyzing a permit is plug those into Google Earth and just take a look at what we're looking at. We actually did this in my environmental law class a couple of nights ago with respect to an ARAP permit to withdraw water, and it was really fun to actually get the bird's eye view of the whole situation, where the creek was, where the plant was going to be, what was in between, including a sewage plant, and so forth. So, individual NPDES permits for other things, for other discharges, other than construction. And I don't have the following pages, but it goes on and on to list those. There's a separate notice for ARAPs, and many of those you really have to find by going to the web page. I have not found that they're actually sending out electronic notices on ARAPs as frequently. Maybe somebody knows that. I haven't seen that. So, okay, good. I'm glad. At the bottom, talk to your friends and clients. This is what they look at. It's kind of vague in general, but it talks about the anti-degradation policy. It also talks about, just above this, I think it talks about how to ask for a public hearing and how to make comments. And we'll get into more of that later. Actually, so what happens is, though, if you, on either an ARAP or an NPDES discharge permit, if you have somebody that's either unhappy or is wondering if they should be unhappy, they should go ahead and they don't have to make a full comment. All they have to do is send an email or a hard copy letter and say, I'd like to have a public hearing on this. And this is one that they did a bunch of sewage treatment plants, STPs, kind of all together because they were all geographically proximate, and so they basically said, let's all get together at this Franklin Recreational Complex in Franklin, Tennessee on Tuesday, October 29th, which is still yet to arrive, and we'll get together and we'll talk about this. And most of the time, sometimes they will actually start at this informational session. They don't always have informational sessions on permits, but if the staff wants to get there ahead of time, or the proponent of the permit wants to get there ahead of time and begin to meet and greet people and try to disabuse them of having any opposition, why they'll try an informational session ahead of time and have pictures and diagrams and stuff, and then they'll start a public hearing. The public hearings are recorded, albeit on the world's worst digital tape recorders, so their transcripts are often unusable. And they become part of what you might call the record of decision, although that's not a term used. So this is, for example, the kinds of instructions that come with one of these hearing notices, and says to people, you know, okay, we're going to control this. You can ask questions, make statements, and answer. And they've really tried for a while, particularly with respect to mining permits. They were trying to have a situation where everybody was taken off into a closet and could talk to one person. And so there was no way to speak to the community and share your concerns and kind of light bulb other people's ideas and concerns. They've gotten away from that. I haven't been at one of these hearings recently, and I don't know whether that question and answer is really being used to gavel people into silence on just comments.
Do you all, have you been to hearings
Well,
recently?
for a coal mining permit, they're going under the LIWA agreement now.
Okay, they're doing the multi-agency.
But they're having the informational period beforehand and then going into the public hearing where you cannot ask questions. But they are having the last
You can't
one,
ask questions.
not during the public hearing part. During the informational period, you can.
That's interesting, because I'll bet you they're using the same notice.
But you can't, when you make your comments, you're making comments to the whole group as well.
Yes, you are it's the format where you're standing in front of the group testifying.
The last one I went to was 6 or 7 years ago, and it was great in terms of back and forth. It was a really small one, the last one I went to. But that's just a couple miles from my house, and I'd like to...
October 29th,
I'll be there.
6 p.m.
Well, anybody who has security, those things come electronically. They come as PDFs, those notices. You're going to have that big TDOC logo on the top. And you can search them. Since they're in Adobe PDF, you can search them. Plug in your county, plug in the name of your EFO, plug in the name of a creek you care about.
The EFO is the TDEC Environmental Field Office.
Right.
And you need to know locally, if you're going to start to do this kind of stuff, you need to get to know your Environmental Field Office staff.
Right. Usually they're short
local
enough.
people.
Usually they're short enough that you can scan through them, and if I'm not overwhelmed, why I try to scan through them and clip out little pieces and email them to people that I think may want to know about them.
So the environmental field offices are regional. In other words, like for Cookeville, where we are, the Cookeville Environmental Field Office serves a bunch of the surrounding counties. So I don't know how many there are in the state, environmental field officers. Probably at least
7 of them.
7.
Before you go into this, you probably should look at the application. That's on the water data viewer. It'll be in a PDF. It will have been scanned from the applicant's submissions. There may be a draft permit with proposed conditions and limitations and so forth on it. You may look at that if there's one of those, because that's what the department thinks it is going to do with this, issue a permit with whatever conditions. And if you still have questions or need documents, and there may be correspondence back and forth, if you're really concerned about one of these with the applicant, because sometimes there's been a good deal of back and forth between the initial permit application and a draft permit or the hearing. You can contact Elizabeth Rory, or you can email her or ask TDEC and ask that they send you scans of all the stuff that's in the file. And I assume they've gotten their high-speed scanner. Water pollution folks over in TDEC have for a long time had the best system for actually taking a stack of documents. They have this super fast high-speed scanner copier, and they just whiz it through. And if you show up, for example, at TDEC main office and say, I'd like to see the file, which by the way, there may be 2 files, one on the permit and one on enforcement. And you stand there while she scans it, she'll say, can I email it to you? And if the answer is yes, I'll take it by email. Then there's no fee.
Whereas if you want your hard copy, paper copies, what, it's
Hard copies
outrageous.
are 15 cents a page now, I think, aren't
They
they?
gave me a CD for $10 a couple weeks ago.
And CDs are generally...
They would have
always
emailed it to me if I didn't want the logs from the permits, which were huge TIF files, but if
Yeah.
I wanted those, I had to get the CD.
So these notices, Brian, you're on a list from TDEC.
Right.
And they'll send you this electronically,
Mhm.
but you have to ask TDEC to get onto that list. And is this list different from the ones they send out in hard copy?
The people who use hard copy right now are mining division, and they've never started putting out an electronic notice that I know of. Have you gotten that in?
The mining division is in Knoxville,
Yeah.
and the rest of
I don't
TDEC.
think mining's sending out electronic yet.
I don't
I'm
think
not-
so.
I'm
because I
still
keep
getting
get-
them in hard
I keep
copy.
getting hard
Yeah,
copies.
they're asking if you want to be on the electronic list.
Are they
or the paper list.
letting the option into that? Okay. Well,
Oil and gas said $300, we can buy this database, which we're about to do, and then you get sort of a subscription to updates, is what they're telling me.
That's, you know, the reason why oil and gas is different is because these notices are actually required by state law, independent of TDEC. There is a state law that basically says that every agency that issues permits or licenses or has appeals therefrom must set up a list where people can provide their email and get notices of applications and permits and licenses and appeals thereof.
So is that Brenda Gilmore's bill?
That was Brenda Gilmore's
that's only
bill
about
back
3 or
when
4
she
years
was a
ago.
freshman in the legislature. But the oil and gas people came back to her and said, this is really slowing us up. We get everybody's permission. Don't worry about it. Let us not have to do this because it puts in a delay because people have to be able to respond to these and so forth. And so,
Which is pretty weird now because the water board is now got oil and gas with it. So I don't, you're going to talk about that.
It's
well,
very curious we have
the
to
point
pay
is,
for
though,
public
they have an
records.
exemption from this other statute,
Right.
so they don't have to send out these electronic notices. And I told Brenda when she did it, she asked me about it, and I said, I don't think that's a good idea. Any industrial activity should be required to provide notice if people want to ask for it. But she did it, and so they are, so basically they've created this system where they can charge you to get notice and database.
Do you know of
access.
any way that they can bar you from sharing that information? They're talking about we need point contact people if you're going to get the database, and we really don't want too much sharing of this information. But Dwayne Gang just put up the interactive map of oil gas wells
I
in the
think that's-
Tennessean, and
I think that's a Tennessee Public Records Act issue, and my suspicion is it's probably completely invalid. They have no exemption under the Tennessee Public Records Act, and unlike the federal act, there's no pre-decisional exemption or any of those kinds of things. I mean, so except for law enforcement records, really,
right.
most anything we'd be interested in is supposed to be right there.
What I hear from Burton and what I hear from Clendenning don't always agree. Clendenning is like, well,
Right.
we give it to the data, or we give the data to the companies, and they do all kinds of stuff with it. So I don't see
Well,
why
in the past, we
nonprofits
would go to
wouldn't
the
be able
general counsel's office at TDEC and get those
Double
things
standard.
resolved in our favor, but the lawyers are leaving too.
Yes.
So one of the other things that comes up in this permitting, and this applies to both discharge permits and ARAP permits, is the anti-degradation statement. The anti-degradation statement, and that's what it's called, even though it's embodied in regulations, is actually required by regulations adopted by the EPA under the Clean Water Act. And there's a very checkered history of the anti-degradation statement and what it means, and you could spend a lot of hours researching that, as I did one time. Recently, Tennessee amended its, was it the anti-degradation? It was the procedural part of the ARAP thing that affects this, I guess.
It's potentially could be a very powerful tool,
Yeah,
but
it's-
they have weakened the procedures of where you can get involved.
So, sorry, these keep cutting off. But basically, they've made it very complicated because you've got all kinds of things going on. You've got whether there are, first of all, you've got whether or not it's high quality waters, in which case you jump to not being able to do anything without proof of economic and social necessity. If it's not high quality waters, you deal with this kind of branch, which is this idea of available conditions. And that gets very complicated because water body segments get listed for where they've been impaired under the 303D list. And if you have, if a permit applicant proposes to do something which is going to impair a piece of a stream by either discharge or alteration, but that part of the stream is not listed, then you wind up having a different situation. This whole thing got litigated to some extent in a very interesting case in Davidson Chancery Court, where Carol McCoy said basically, none of this makes any sense to me. If it's impaired, it's impaired.
The chancellor said.
Yeah, you know, it doesn't make any sense to me that it's got to be impaired for the same. Then you want to impair. You're taking injured water, impaired water, and you're making it worse, albeit in a way that was different than what it has. And you shouldn't be doing that.
And Elizabeth Murphy case.
I think Elizabeth did that, yeah. And they really haven't completely come to grips with that whole thing.
Yeah.
But they are still, on the face of it, they are still taking the position that only if you want to do something that adds on an impaired parameter do you really begin to get in trouble with anti-day.
Tomorrow morning, we have a whole session on basic Tennessee water quality law, so I thought we were going to do that one first, but they put the public participation first. So some of this, like we have about 8 or 10 more pages of statutes and regulations on the law than we have on the public participation point. It used to be that you could use this anti-degradation. They would do the hearings earlier, and you could really make have an impact on the social and economic necessity argument. And now they kind of put it all together in one time for a hearing.
It's not clear where that is yet, but this is at least a shopping list of some of the things you can argue have to be explored as alternatives, so that you have avoidance. And for people that haven't, are kind of going through this for the first time, why that's one thing apart from finding yourself an expert or somebody with more experience to kind of look and say, well, did they really deal with these possible alternatives depending on whether it was a discharge, water withdrawal, and so forth. For example, the water withdrawal that I was just looking at a couple of days ago with my class was saying, well, the local water supply district can't give us enough water. They'd have to change a whole lot of infrastructure. And it doesn't explain anything. It just says that as a conclusion. And it doesn't talk about water reuse. It doesn't talk about water harvesting and storage from what is to be affected here, which is a relatively low flow stream at sometimes, or getting it from someplace else and so on.
So TDEC's not really doing this thorough look at alternatives.
That's the applicant. The applicant's basically saying, we checked it out and we don't have any choice but to suck water out of the stream, even though that stream's only a foot deep sometimes.
So who was it that said they had been looking at the data viewer and they were taking straight the language from the permit application into the permit?
Yeah, that accusation has been made. This one is so embryonic that I've been dealing with. It's Lick Creek over in Greene County, or I think it's Lick Creek, yeah. Anyway, man. So you're talking about up here exceptional Tennessee waters, which basically is stuff that's in pretty good shape. There's actually a long list in the regs after this, or a short list of places that have already been identified. But you can certainly go in and argue, both apart from this process in advance or in this process, that the water ought to be recognized as what we used to call Tier 2 or exceptional Tennessee waters. And you're not supposed to be allowed to do anything to those waters unless it's economically and socially necessary, and doesn't become injurious to classified use.
So one of
Classified
my
use is a term of art.
best successes was this little airport wetland that they wanted to fill, and the airport was trying to justify, you know, the need for more hangars to fill this wetland. And, you know, we've done litigation, we've done state court administrative stuff, and then we're finally at this economic and social necessity. So, and somehow there got to be a newspaper article that the reporter says there's been this investment. All these hangars at the airport were vacant, or people were storing their boats and them are using. So they really, and it got sent around to all the agency people. So right there, it established there was no economic and social necessity for more hangars at the airport.
And in that case, at that point, the fellow who was in charge of the wetlands permitting basically held a hearing, and the economists from Tech took both sides of the issue, some for us, some for the airport, and so forth. Nobody has ever challenged this that says that they're not going to do this, they're going to look at alternatives, but not relook at social and economic necessity. However, if a permit is ever abandoned, then it starts over. And there's at least one case I know of where a water district to have treated water abandoned an intake on a small creek, and then years later wanted to come back, and they said, well, wait a minute, you know, we're not just going to let you start that pump again. We're going to have to go through the whole thing, and they actually were denied a permit. So you've got a situation where this determination under the regulations is made by department staff now. It actually used to be made separately, and then the staff's determination, they call it the departments, but it's actually done in the name of the commissioner, is justified or unjustified, can go to the Water Quality Review Board under the following procedures. A whole bunch of procedures we'll go through very quickly here, but basically that is a separate preliminary step, because if economic and social necessity is not found, then they can't finish the permit process, and if it's appealed, they can't finish the permit process until that adjudication is finished, which can include the Water Quality Board, and then it can include judicial review of the board's decision. Now this is important if you get in kind of late. You always need to make sure that the water people know that you care about this. And one of the first things I advise people to do is, when they see a permit that they're the least bit concerned about, or that they think someone they know will be concerned about, is to email the department and say, list us as a person of interest, an interested person. And if you get on that, they actually create a little magic email list for each permit, if they get any statements like that. And they add you to, obviously, the other people they'll notify, which includes the permit applicant. So anything that they do, you get notice this way. And there's a big, long, after this, information definition and stuff. And a lot of it goes back to some EPA forms that are really out of date and inapposite for, I mean, they were made essentially primarily for discharge situations. They don't work very well for ARAPs, and they don't work very well for a lot of other permitting. So you should skim through that when you get to one, and everybody fills out all the forms like good little school kids, but it usually doesn't tell you a lot of what you need to know there. But this determination of economic and social necessity can be critical, and it is a place where you can actually stop a permitting process. It takes some effort, but for example, recently there was a permit that was issued, and the finding of social and economic necessity that supported it was basically, this is in a poor county, and this coal mine will provide a few more jobs. And as soon as that was pushed back on, the coal company actually abandoned the permit, says, okay, we're not going to do this, because if the idea that you created half a dozen jobs was social and economic necessity, you would have absolutely no real analysis of any pushback on protecting the environment unless it really was really necessary. So you get to public participation, and the reg is broken down in terms of how they're going to notify on NPDES, and use a newspaper notice.
And those will often be in small papers that really you'll never see. Folks will never see. But the sign, you worked on the sign. I don't know if they put in better provisions on the sign? No?
No. The signs are still, the department had actually settled with us on a case and said that they were actually going to make a great big sign that was like 4 by 4. Cut in half a piece of plywood and set it up and put big letters on it, and put it right out inside
right
the site.
on the sides, so that it'd be
and
really
so
visible.
And what they instead really did was they took a bunch of 18-inch length paper and put this little bitty type on, and then of course once you put it on a post by the edge of the road, while the weeds grow up around it, nobody ever sees it. So the on-site signage thing here is still crappy.
But neighbors will sometimes see that, and
Occasionally.
you know, if you have clients or groups, that's something to look for.
I always tell people to go out and look for the sign, and of course if it's not there, they should figure out the best they can do is say, look, I walked all up and down, there was no sign. And if there was a sign, but you can't really read it, see it for whatever reason, take a picture of that. This is how the ARAP fits in with 401 of the Clean Water Act, which requires that the state certify that an activity will not adversely affect its water quality. And basically, the two ways that TDEC does that is it sometimes writes a letter saying this is a 401 certification, and other times they issue an ARAP. And as far as the Corps is concerned, that's a 401 certification. I think it says so on the face of it. But that's where you can get all of the controls and conditions if something's going to happen, but you want to minimize the impact of it. And then you got public participation. And this is the trigger, you know, that the applicant has to say they're going to seek degradation, and half the applicant's consultants don't know anything about degradation, and they don't bother to tell the department there, and the department comes back and says you're actually going to have to do anti-deg here. You got to tell us all these things, and then you're going to have to provide notice. So at that point, you've made comments, you've had hopefully a hearing with the department, you've argued about anti-deg, you've argued about probably the permit too to some extent, and then you wind up going to the Water Quality Board, and you go to their website, and it looks sort of like this. It has a whole list of the dates. The September 17 or the October 15, 16 is really interesting because they're actually going to try the NPDES for Bull Run, and the issue is going to be whether the controls for coal ash on the Bull Run coal plant are adequate.
Is that moving? That they are having that now?
As far as I know, it's been rolled over and rolled over and rolled over.
Yeah, when I talked to Stephanie last week, she said they didn't know if they had a quorum again.
Yeah,
Well, that's a problem with the water board.
Yeah.
And it's been a problem, and it probably will continue to be. It's these citizen appointees, and now it's much bigger because it includes all these oil and gas people.
Well, it's only 2 more people.
But, you know, they lots of times don't show up, and so there's no quorum. So these cases just go on and on and on. I mean, it might take 18 months to get a hearing. in the water board because you don't get a quorum of the citizen members of the board.
I think moving forward, though, they're all going to be heard by administrative
Well,
law judges.
that's a new
That's what they-
statutory change, and we will, yeah, and I don't know that we've seen any new, any hearings under this new system, but
Yeah,
it's
I'm
gonna,
not sure when it
they're
went
gonna
into
be-
effect or.
Stephanie said this Bull Run case was not gonna be done that way
No,
because it was
right.
filed
It was
before.
filed before, right?
But now, under the statutory change last year, all the contested cases are gonna go to be heard by an administrative
When do
law
we
judge
have to finish this, Mary?
in 5 minutes. So
Thanks.
there's a lot to go through here.
Okay.
You want me to do it?
No.
None of the 12 members of the board.
I thought I had a slide in here that had, you can see that the board members are actually, they all represent essentially pollution interests, and I don't,
There's one environmental interest out of all
the
of the
commissioner is
others.
represented in judging his own permitting. The Department of Health, the woman there used to be a permit writer at TDEC, she's actually fairly good. But the Farm Bureau's there. The public at large person is appointed by the Hook and Bullet Lobby, not by any real mainstream environmental organization, not appointed by, but nominated by. I'm not sure, I'm not sure where they get that, but the environmental interest is the Hook and Bullet people, the Wildlife Federation. And then the counties, who of course run all the dumps as well as some of the water treatment. The agricultural interests, again, the Farm Bureau. You know, the Department of Agriculture right now, the Secretary, the Commissioner of Agriculture is actually used to be the Executive Director of the Farm Bureau, so it's all one thing. A person representing municipalities, of course, they do the wastewater treatment plants and the water treatment plants. And this small generator representing automotive interests, which is Jim Cameron, who's actually a pretty good guy but a fairly hard-nosed lawyer. I can't remember who holds that seat right now, but here we go. You can see, if you know these people or go watch these things, you'll just see that you're really fighting uphill on trying to get a majority ruling either in favor of enforcement or against the grant of a permit.
So, it's been a very difficult
Yes, that was
forum
it.
to actually make things happen for us. And this bill in the legislature last year, the statute now, that would change the order. If you are in a contested case, now it's going to go to an administrative law judge.
We don't know absolutely nothing about
But-
water quality.
But that may be better, but the problem is that decision can be appealed to the whole board before you get a chance to go to Chancery Court. The Davidson County Chancery Court, which is where you would take an appeal on this, is pretty good court. I mean, those women judges
And
are
that's the difficulty, because it's actually delayed, because you can go ahead and make your record in front of the ALJs, but if the board's got the board can, either side can appeal to the board, in which case you could have one of these 18-month delays just in getting a reviewable decision made, even if it's just a rubber stamp, okay, with what happened in front of the ALJ, which is quite likely.
So the board could overturn the law, the administrative
Yes,
law judge?
that's, yeah, yes.
They can, and in fact, they can pull up a case from the ALJ. The ALJ makes a decision. Any board member can move that the board pull the case up too.
Well, we
So-
really haven't seen how this is going to work, but it's not going to work
Well,
probably.
that's what the reg says, though, that they can do that.
I want to go in the last 2 or 3 minutes unless you object.
I want to do the 118A.
Okay, I was going to say, we got to do the 118A, and then we should talk about ways to
We're
have
out of time.
input in stormwater, and then we should talk about
That's the
ways to
next
have
one.
input on water quality, and then we should have ways, there's 2 days before the water board that are citizen participation days, the one in October and the one in April,
Right.
where anybody can come and make their own statement. Okay, now,
That's right.
118A.
That's right. I forgot that on the 16th, they're going to actually have to take public comments before they start the contested case. 118A is a sort of a separate path of citizen work. 118A of the Tennessee Water Quality Act basically says that any citizen, any resident can file a complaint saying that the water quality people are taking inadequate steps to protect the water from
And filing a
pollution.
complaint can be just a letter to the commissioner. a letter to the commissioner from a citizen that says, I want this to be treated as a complaint under 118A. And then they've got to give you a written decision within 6 months.
I think it's 60 days.
60 days.
And you can send along photographs and so forth, and it can be done by email. The value of that is
30 days.
Is it 40 days now?
30 days.
I thought it was 60.
Well,
We
this
gotta
is
check,
taken
make sure
straight
that's-
from the
We got to check, make sure that's right.
If
At
the
any
commissioner
rate,
fails to take the action stated in the notification,
You have to get a written.
no, it's 90 days, then they get an opportunity to respond, and then there's 30 days. So the commissioner has to take action from a letter
thought it was
within
longer.
90 days.
Okay. And usually the practice until, I don't know if this is now that the lawyer staff has turned over, but the enforcement in TDEC used to have the practice of sending you an acknowledgement letter that they had a 118A, and that's not required in the rules, and then you knew that it had gotten docketed, it had gotten acknowledged as a 118A. The ultimate power of this thing, if you have the resources and facts to do it, is that if the standard for appeal of the department's response to how they handled your complaint, at the response that comes in 90 days, they say, okay, we did this and that and the other thing. If you're not happy with that, you can appeal to the water board by simply asserting that it was an inadequate response. Very vague standard.
So that-
I'm not happy.
And that appeal
It's an
must
I'm
be-
not happy appeal.
That appeal must be made within 30 days after receipt of the
Right,
notification.
and the letters of the notices, 118A notices say that.
So, and I'm not sure, because any citizen can write that letter, but if you're going to get involved with the water board, if you're on behalf of an organization,
Then you'd
you
have to
got
have a lawyer.
you got to have lawyers, and that's a really bad thing that is in the law right now.
On the other hand, we're not advising people to try pro se 118A complaints in front of the board either. So. And that, you know, we've really had only a couple of 118As ever go to the board, and generally the reaction of the department is, when those are filed with the board, is let's sit down and talk about this. There must be something we can do to make you happier. So in that sense, it gives you leverage for a new round of enforcement.
And other than these NPDES permits and ARAP permits and ways to appeal them, and the 118A complaints, citizen input to the water board in October and in April at their meetings.
This coming Tuesday?
Yeah, the other ways are with your local environmental field office of TDEC to make complaints if you see something that's happening. And the stormwater stuff, every municipality has got to have,
No, not every, but the,
of a certain size.
yeah.
Under federal law. And there's a lot of ways citizens can have input into stormwater protections in their municipalities through their local environmental field office or the city's stormwater. So that's a really important thing. Municipal stormwater is a big pollutant. And that's something you can do locally if you're in a small town. We have worked with the city on the stormwater ordinances, try to make them stronger.
But remember, sediment primarily off of agricultural lands is still the single biggest pollutant in this state.
Construction.
Okay?
That's
Thank you for being so patient with us.